everyone was so cheerful tonight, and I saw my first monarch today, and I should be cheerful, but let me take us down a notch. Habitat loss. None of us have to drive very far to see habitat loss. Sometimes we can look out our windows and see habitat loss. Tonight's speaker is not just wringing her hands, worrying about habitat loss, but she's counting birds, she's analyzing where they are, where they thrive, where they don't thrive. Did I say she's analyzing data? Did I say Dr. Given Harper, when he was pressed several months ago about presenting that data to our group, he said, Leah can do it. And I said, oh, Dr. Harper, is that a colleague from Wesleyan? And he said, no. I said, oh, you're a graduate student? No. He said, when I spoke to him, he said, she's a junior. And there was a long pause. And I thought, a junior? He said, she can do it. She knows the numbers. She's been working on this project. Then when I finally got to meet Leah and read her long list of awards and credentials, and she is a Udall Scholar, by the way, and many of us are old enough to remember the Udalls and what they did for habitat, think, okay, well, she's pretty good. And she is perfect for this because she is a bird nerd. Wave your hand if you too are a bird nerd. I said, Leah, how did you become a bird nerd? And she said, well, my grandparents fed the birds, and my parents fed the birds. And I used to sit as a young child in the picture window and watch the birds. And then I started taking pictures of the birds. And then when I came to Wesleyan, where she just graduated from 2 weeks ago, when I came to Wesleyan, and this is what'll have you all dabbing your eyes because it brought tears to mine. She said, when I came to Wesleyan and looked at all the opportunities here and saw that what Dr. Harper was working on, I thought, I can do something to benefit the ecology of Bloomington-Normal, to benefit the ecology of Bloomington-Normal. And now, tonight, this brilliant young scholar who was born in 1998 is going to tell us how we can benefit the ecology wherever we live. Thank you so much, Leah, for sticking with us and teaching us tonight.
Thank you very much, Marcia, for that awesome introduction. And thank you everyone else for being here tonight and tuning into this presentation. As Marcia said, I am a very, very recent graduate of Illinois Wesleyan University. And during my time there, I was an environmental studies student with a minor in biology. And for the past 3 years or so, I've been working with Dr. Given Harper and another IWU alum, Rachel Schenecker, to study the diversity and abundance of breeding birds in Bloomington-Normal. And we've ended up comparing our Bloomington-Normal data to data from the agricultural areas surrounding central Illinois. And tonight, I'm going to give an overview of our project, share some of our current findings and early conclusions, and I'll also explain how they connect to the importance of native plants and habitats. I'd like to mention that I am definitely no expert in native plants or landscaping for wildlife. So what I have to share tonight is really just the tip of the iceberg of what we can do in our own yards to benefit bird populations and to improve native habitat as it relates to birds. So if there are any questions about the presentation or anything that isn't clear, I'll be happy to answer questions at the end. But for now, I'm excited to get started. I'm just going to get some of these Zoom boxes out of the way. All right. And there we go. All right. So in the summer of 2018, Dr. Given Harper, who was my faculty advisor, got reports and saw for himself that there were several bird species in Bloomington-Normal that generally aren't expected to be found in urban spaces, let alone during the breeding season. And these species included the Bell's vireo, the red-shouldered hawk, a northern parula warbler, the Acadian flycatcher, and several fish crows. And these birds got Dr. Harper wondering about the full range of bird species that might be using Bloomington-Normal for the breeding season, and whether or not more unexpected bird species could be found utilizing urban spaces. So this was the motivation for organizing our breeding bird survey, and it's what led us to determine, to do this survey to determine which bird species were present during the breeding season. But then, as we began to review some of the scientific literature, we made some discoveries that led us to broadening the scope of our research. First, several recent studies have found that since 1970, there has been a loss of approximately 2.9 billion birds in North America alone. Factors like pesticide use and climate change contribute to this population decline, but the biggest cause is certainly habitat loss. In this figure, seen here on the right, we can see the percentage of decline, or the percentage of species that have experienced population declines by their habitat group. So each of these colored horizontal bars represents a group of birds that exists within a similar habitat or uses a similar habitat. And the bar represents the percentage of those species that have experienced population declines. We can see that since 1970, almost every habitat group has had species that have experienced population decline. The only group that hasn't, or the only group that has experienced more of an increase, is wetland birds, and that's likely due to different habitat remediation efforts. The group that has experienced, or the group that has the species with the most decline, is the grassland birds, and that correlates to the fact that in North America, much of our grassland habitat has been lost to conversion to agriculture. The bird here, shown on the bottom left, is an upland sandpiper, which is a grassland bird that has experienced the impact, or the negative impacts, of habitat loss. The upland sandpiper is what's called an obligate grassland bird, meaning that it doesn't use any other type of habitat besides grassland. And so they've often been used as an indicator of healthy tallgrass prairie. The fact that the upland sandpiper is considered endangered in Illinois is a telltale sign of the fact that our tallgrass prairie really isn't doing well. In fact, our tallgrass prairie is pretty much non-existent now in Illinois. Just over 100 years ago, the tallgrass prairie was the dominant habitat, or the dominant land cover in our state. But then at the turn of the century, the majority of the prairie had already disappeared. In this graph, we can see the percent change in the different land cover types in Illinois over the past 100 years. Each of these colored bands represents a different habitat type. And back in 1820, over half of Illinois was tallgrass prairie, with a little bit of marsh here in light blue and some deciduous forest represented by this darkest green. By the turn of the century, most of our tallgrass prairie had been taken over by small, fairly diverse farmsteads and some cornfields. But then by 1950, even those small, more diverse grain farms were taken over almost completely by monocultures of corn and soybeans. Monoculture simply means that only one species of plant is being grown in that space. Today, the majority of Illinois is now used for corn and soybeans, with a little bit going to small grains, hay, and pasture. So all in total, the majority of Illinois is now being used for agriculture instead of tallgrass prairie and woodland. We also learned from a 2018 study by Dr. Michael P. Ward and other authors that of the bird species that have actually experienced population increases in Illinois over the last century, many of them, or over half of them actually, have expanded into urban spaces. This was an important finding for us because it suggested that even though urban spaces have their own disadvantages for birds, places like Bloomington-Normal could support bird populations as their preferred natural habitat.
Sorry, Leah, I accidentally muted you.
That's A-okay. Can you all hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So this discovery that the species that had experienced population growth in Illinois over the past 100 years had expanded into urban areas also provided an explanation as for why Dr. Harper and other local birders spotted these unexpected birds in Bloomington-Normal. These two birds here on the right are prime examples of species that have successfully assimilated to urban environments. The one here on the top is the northern cardinal, which is actually our state bird, And the cardinal only used to be found in the southern forests of Illinois, but they have since moved north, and they can now be found in almost any urban or suburban environment so long as there is some trees and some shrubby habitat. The bird here on the bottom is a chipping sparrow, and they prefer habitats that have coniferous trees and some shrubby area that's bordering open spaces. So they've adapted really well to urban and suburban parks and roadsides. Come on. Sometimes the slides don't like to cooperate. There we go. So with these preliminary findings in mind, our research team developed a study to examine the hypothesis that urban areas support a greater avian species diversity and abundance than rural areas. To begin this examination, we collected data through urban bird surveys throughout Bloomington-Normal in the summers of 2019 and 2020. And we also gathered data from up to 7 years of the USGS breeding bird survey from the 7 BBS routes that are closest to Bloomington-Normal. And I'll explain a bit more about what that is in a few slides. So for our urban bird surveys, we conducted the surveys at 42 sites in a variety of urban habitats throughout Bloomington-Normal, including parks and other green spaces like golf courses and a cemetery, along residential roadsides, and on 6 sections of the Constitution Trail, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with Bloomington-Normal, the Constitution Trail is a large network of biking and walking trails. This map of Bloomington-Normal shows all 42 of our sites, and for a bit of spatial context, here is I-55 running along the left and the top of the map. Here's Route 66, and Illinois Wesleyan's campus is here, left of center. All of our green spaces and parks are naturally labeled in green. Our Constitution Trail transects are in red, and the road transects are in orange. For comparison between urban and agricultural areas in central Illinois, we selected the 7 USGS breeding bird survey routes that are closest to Bloomington-Normal. The USGS breeding bird survey, more commonly just called the BBS, is a long-term population monitoring effort that was organized by the USGS Patuxent Wildlife Research Center and Environment Canada's Canadian Wildlife Service. Through the BBS program, bird surveys are conducted every year across North America by experienced birders, and so it really provides a wealth of data for these more rural areas. In this figure, the pathway of each of the BBS routes that we referenced are mapped. Here is Leroy, this is Fairbury, here is Gridley, this is Minonk, then Waynesville, Deer Creek, and Mackinac. And each of these 7 routes are located in really agricultural areas. And here is Bloomington-Normal in the center. We also conducted an urban habitat analysis to see if the birds that we recorded in Bloomington-Normal showed a preference for specific habitat characteristics. In the field, we recorded the circumference of mature trees, the tree height, and recorded the tree species. And with different computer applications, we estimated the housing density, tree canopy cover, and land cover around each of our sites. To compare the land cover between the urban and the rural sites, we use the National Land Cover Database 2016 land cover map. We can see from this section of the 2016 land cover map that the majority of central Illinois is agriculture, and more specifically is made of cultivated cropland. So again, think the corn and the soybeans. The cultivated cropland here is indicated in brown, and the urban spaces like Bloomington-Normal here in the center are in different shades of red. There are some patches of forest and pasture which are in green and yellow, and the water bodies are in blue. We used a mapping software called ArcMap 10.5 to measure the approximate area of the 15 different land cover types labeled here within the corporate limits of Bloomington-Normal and within a 2-kilometer buffer around each of the BBS routes. As expected, around each of the BBS routes, within a 2-kilometer radius, the majority of the land was always cultivated crop. The lowest percentage, I think, was 74%, but the highest one was 92%. All of our analyses related to the land cover and the different urban characteristics are ongoing, but I can share some of our preliminary results relating to species diversity and abundance with you all tonight. To measure, this graph shows the species richness of Bloomington-Normal, which is labeled in red, all of the BBS routes with the data pooled together here in this bar, and all the BBS routes individually. Species richness is simply the number of species observed at a specific location, and we average that number by the number of years of data that we collected for each site. Bloomington-Normal had 2 years, and the BBS routes ranged from 4 to 6 years, depending on how many times or how often those routes are run. From this graph, we can see that all of the BBS routes pulled together had the highest number of species, but no individual BBS route had more species on average than Bloomington-Normal. To measure bird species diversity, we used a measure called the Shannon Diversity Index, which takes into account the number of species and the number of individuals of each species present at a given location. From this graph, we can see the Shannon Diversity Index for each site. It's shown up here in the blue bars, which are on the top. And though all of the indices are fairly similar for each of the sites, the route called Fairbury had the lowest diversity index, and Bloomington-Normal had the third highest index behind only Deer Creek and Leroy. When considering why these differences in bird species diversity might have arisen, we looked at the percentage of the different land cover types at each site, focusing specifically on the percentage of cultivated cropland, since we were trying to compare rural agricultural areas to our urban spaces. And even though we haven't been able to perform true statistical analyses on the pattern that we found, from this graph, we can see that there is likely somewhat of a relationship. So Fairbury, which had the lowest diversity index, had the highest percentage of cultivated cropland within a 2-kilometer radius around the route. Whereas Deer Creek, which was the site with the highest diversity index, had the lowest amount of cultivated cropland out of all the BBS sites, or all the BBS routes. So as the percentage of cultivated cropland increased, or as more cultivated cropland was present around each of these bird survey routes, the Shannon Diversity Index decreased slightly. Interestingly, when we looked at which of the species was most abundant in our urban and rural routes, the same 4 species came out on top. In Bloomington-Normal, or in our urban space, the American robin was by far the most abundant species, but the European starling, red-winged blackbird, and common grackle were also all fairly abundant. In the rural routes, the red-winged blackbird was the most abundant, followed by the American robin, the common grackle, and then the European starling. It is important to note that the European starling, which is the bird down here on the bottom right, is a non-native species, if you couldn't guess by its name, and it does outcompete native birds for nesting cavities. We also documented the number of species of greatest conservation need, or SGCN, at each survey site. SGCN is a classification given by the USGS to species that are experiencing population declines and are also particularly vulnerable to other threats like habitat loss. Though not all SGCN are considered endangered, they are at risk of becoming so if efforts aren't taken to protect them soon. This graph tells a similar story to that for species richness. We can see that when all the BBS routes are combined, we get the highest number of SGCN at 20, but no individual BBS route had more SGCN than Bloomington-Normal, which had 16. These are 6 of the 16 SGCN that we saw in Bloomington-Normal. The chimney swift is a really cool bird because it actually doesn't come out of the sky except for when it nests. So it spends its whole life flying in the sky from the moment it can get out of the nest until it needs to come in and raise its own young. The northern flicker and red-headed woodpecker are both in the woodpecker family, and so they use a lot of dead wood for nesting. So if you have any dead trees in your backyard, or you see dead trees in parks, so long as they're not at risk of damaging any people or property, they're great as nesting sites for these 2 species and for other woodpeckers. The dickcissel is another obligate grassland species, so it's only really going to be found in big open fields, preferably with some prairie plants or some other tall grass. The bald eagle, I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's our national bird, and they're generally going to be found in areas with some body of water because they really do love to fish. And the yellow-breasted chat is another interesting bird because even though it's bright yellow, you're rarely going to see it. It prefers really dense shrubby habitat, so it's really hard to see through all of the foliage and plant life. So most of the times, the yellow-breasted chat is identified by its song. So based on all of these early findings, our preliminary conclusion for our study is that urban spaces can support a breeding bird population that is at least as diverse, if not more, than the rural agricultural areas in central Illinois. The number of different species was higher in Bloomington-Normal than any of the rural BBS routes, and the Shannon Diversity Index for Bloomington-Normal was the third highest. When observing how the diversity index related to the amount of cultivated cropland at each site, we saw a potential inverse relationship, meaning that as the amount of cultivated cropland increased, the diversity index decreased. We have also come to understand some of the limitations of urban spaces. Towns and cities like Bloomington-Normal bring more and unique threats to urban birds, including windows and other buildings to run into, and outdoor cats as predators. But one of the biggest shortcomings or fallings of urban spaces is that they lack the habitat area needed for some birds. Many species, especially grassland species, are what we called area sensitive, meaning that in order for them to choose a site for breeding and nesting, it not only has to be the correct habitat, but it also has to be large enough to be considered suitable. For example, the eastern meadowlark, which is the bird here on the top right, requires at least 14.5 acres of a specific habitat, of grassland habitat, to consider nesting in that space. The bobolink, down here on the bottom right, requires at least 25 acres. The eastern meadowlark was only spotted in Bloomington-Normal at our 2 golf course sites, which had the largest patches of grassland in our urban surveys, and the bobolink wasn't found in Bloomington-Normal at all. It was only identified on the BBS routes, where the agricultural fields can sometimes act as large patches of grassland. These 2 screenshots from Google Maps do a really good job at displaying the differences in habitat area present in urban versus agricultural spaces. Both of these habitats are fragmented. You can see the different agricultural fields are split up, and so no habitat is truly continuous in either the agricultural area or Bloomington-Normal. But you can also see that the patches in agricultural spaces are larger. And so unlike urban areas, the agricultural area might do a better job at reaching those minimum habitat requirements of certain area-sensitive species. So thus far from our study, we have learned that while urban spaces will not be suitable for all birds, they can support a greater diversity and abundance of species in general than the intensive agricultural landscape of central Illinois. The main question of tonight, though, is beyond having the right kind of habitat, how do bird abundance and diversity relate to native plants? And the key to this question is insects and other bugs. Specifically, herbivorous or plant-eating insects like caterpillars and arthropods like spiders. These bugs are essential, insanely essential, important parts of large and diverse food webs. They are considered the bridge between plant life and the bigger organisms like birds, rodents, fish, and eventually even humans. It's pretty much impossible to overstate the importance of insects and arthropods for bird populations. About 96%, so pretty much all of North American bird species rely on insects and arthropods like spiders to feed their young during the breeding season because these bugs provide high protein, calcium, and other nutrients that are essential for nestling growth. Without insects and spiders and other arthropods, fewer birds will get enough nutrition to reach adulthood and have their own young and maintain population sizes of their species. Recent studies suggest that, on average, the abundance, richness, and survival of these important plant-eating insects is reduced by non-native plants. In his book, Bringing Nature Home, Douglas Ptolemy suggests that there are 3 major reasons for this. The first is that many of the non-native ornamental plant species that have become widespread in North America were actually introduced on purpose because they were found to be pest-free. These plant species include honeysuckle, autumn olive, Norway maple, multiflora rose, and many others. Their seemingly natural ability to ward off insects is because they are unpalatable to bugs, either through their structure or because of their chemical makeup, and thus these bugs will avoid eating them. Non-native honeysuckle, which is shown in these pictures below, comes in several varieties that produce these pretty white flowers in the spring and bright red berries in the fall. And so honeysuckle was introduced as an ornamental to be a pretty addition to someone's yard. But it was actually also introduced to provide more habitat for wildlife because it does grow as a dense shrub. Obviously, like with many other introduced species, this backfired, and honeysuckle is now one of the biggest problems for an invasive species, or as an invasive species, in the wooded areas of Illinois. It takes over all the understory in wooded areas. It's hard to contain. And even though adding berries to a wooded area might seem like a good way to support wildlife, the berries of honeysuckle are actually not that nutritious. So this becomes a really big problem for birds because as they're attracted to this fruit to try and, build up their energy before a long fall migration or during a winter stopover, they're not going to be getting the sustenance that they need to maintain their energy levels and to, frankly, survive the winter. It's kind of like if you encounter a starving person and offer them low-calorie popcorn as a way to help them feel better, as a remedy. Not very effective. The second and third point brought up by Talamy sort of work together. The second point is that it takes a long time, an evolutionary amount of time, for an insect to adapt to the unique chemical makeup of a plant. So all plants, like most organisms, have their own sort of unique makeup with different chemicals that they use for defense and communication. And not every plant can stomach or survive off of those different chemical makeups. So as a new plant is introduced, it doesn't have as many predators because there are fewer insects eating it. And then it has the ability to take over the natural habitat on which these insects and indirectly birds survive. The third point is that most herbivorous insects are specialists, and so they're only going to be seeking out the 1 to 2 to 3 plant species with which they evolved. So even if by some chance an insect could potentially stomach and survive off of a new plant species, they're not going to be seeking out that plant. So they're not even going to be testing the waters with that plant in the first place. A really good example of this is the monarch butterfly and its caterpillar. As I'm sure many of you know, the monarch butterfly only lays its eggs on milkweed species, most often the common milkweed species. Because of this, the monarch butterfly caterpillar will hatch and then feed on only the milkweed species. So without this plant, or if any other non-native plant came in and overpowered the milkweed species, the monarch butterfly would be in a lot of trouble, and that caterpillar would no longer be found in gardens and prairies to support birds and other organisms. Therefore, increasing the presence of non-native plants may reduce the availability of insects and other bugs for prey for birds, thereby limiting the number of birds that can get enough food to become healthy adults. In short, native plants support the species and abundance of insects that are necessary for birds to maintain their populations. And even though non-native plants have their own ecological functions, they might support some insects, they might provide some fruit, they don't support the same insect species or abundance as native plants, and thus don't provide the quality or quantity of food that is essential for breeding birds. Thinking back to our study that looks at the diversity of birds in urban versus agricultural habitats, we can see that in agricultural fields, there'll just be one species of plant covering dozens to hundreds of acres. This might work for some grassland bird species if they can find enough food and if they can finish nesting and breeding and nesting and fledging before the crop is harvested. But for most bird species, this isn't going to work for them. They're not going to be able to find the resources that they need in this kind of space. In Bloomington-Normal, though habitats are also fragmented, maybe even more so than in agricultural areas, there are still parks, backyards, roadsides with trees, shrubs, and other plants. And so the landscape of an urban space includes a greater diversity of plant life. So in turn, it can support a greater diversity and abundance of food and other resources for birds. It's important to remember, however, that urban spaces pose their own challenges for birds, and landscaping is oftentimes not intended to be wildlife friendly. So what can we do? That is also the big question of tonight. And as members of Wild Ones, you are all probably very aware of the power we have to influence the environment through our own backyards. But it can be quite difficult to figure out how to attract the most and the best bugs for birds, mainly because there really isn't a best way. There are thousands and thousands of insect and arthropod species and thousands of species of birds. And with all of this data that's been collected, and all this data that still hasn't been collected, it's really hard to formulate any sort of clear database for which insects prefer which plants, support the best and most protein-filled insects for which birds, and really there isn't any set answer as to which plants will bring in the most insects or bring in the most birds. Thankfully, there are a few places that we can start. A lot of this information I'm going to share comes from Ptolemy's book, Bringing Nature Home, which was published in 2009. And these are just, again, tip of the iceberg things that can help us get some ideas, help us as a starting place for making our yards more accommodating to breeding bird species. First, which is kind of the main point of this presentation and Ptolemy's book, is that anytime you can, which is hopefully every time, use native plants over non-natives. This, I feel like, should be a pretty probable thing to do. There are so many plants that are native to our area, and many of them are gorgeous and look great in yards and do well in yards. And what's also important to consider is that look for plants, or something that is important for us to consider to do, is to look for plants that aren't just native to North America, but are also native to our specific region, of the state. There are some plants that I won't find 2 hours south of here in Bloomington-Normal that I do up here in my hometown closer to Chicago. So doing a little bit of research can really make a big difference when it comes to choosing the right plants to bring into our yards. Another more specific tip is that oak, willow, and cherry tree species together can host over 1,400 insect species. So even with all these different options out there for which flowers or trees or shrubs to bring in, these 3 species alone can make a big difference for how many insects and thus how many birds will benefit from our yards. I've seen this in action with oak trees. There's a big one in my backyard, and last May, when I was still in quarantine, I went out there one morning and saw 5 or 6 different species of migrating warblers coming through and using this oak tree to pick off different insects before continuing on their way north. And my yard is near some more natural area, but it's still definitely a residential suburban space. And so the fact that these warblers chose this oak tree out of all the other different spaces, all the other different trees in the area, is really telling that oak trees can do a great deal for our birds. And last big tip is that bringing caterpillars and butterflies into our yard is a really great place to start when it comes to increasing insect species in our spaces. Caterpillars and butterflies and moths make up a huge percentage of the insect species in North America. And so planting specifically for them is a great way to bring these species that are fatty and full of protein for baby birds into our yards and into our neighborhoods. What's key, though, when you consider planting for butterflies and moths, that they don't just need plants for food, they also need plants for reproduction. I talked about before how the monarch butterfly only uses the milkweed plant for laying its eggs, and other butterfly and moth species follow the same pattern, where there'll be one plant species, 1 or 2 plant species, on which they lay their eggs and have their caterpillars grow. 3 key species, or 3 species that can play both of these roles of feeding and helping the butterflies reproduce, are milkweed, black-eyed Susans, and coneflowers. These are all really pretty species that'll bring more caterpillars and butterflies to your yard, and in turn will help support more bird species. If you don't have a yard, there is still a lot that you can do. My advice is to look to your local parks and forest preserves and see what opportunities are there for you to lend a helping hand. Most towns have some sort of organization or parks department that'll have volunteering opportunities. In Bloomington-Normal specifically, there's the Parklands Foundation, which maintains and restores a lot of gorgeous natural habitat all throughout the Mackinac River area and close to Bloomington-Normal. And right in Normal is the Ecology Action Center, which runs the Sugar Creek Stewards, which does a great job of restoring the creek habitat that goes through town. You can also reach out to your parks departments if you see anything in your park that could be improved, an area that could use more native species, an area with too many non-native species. Contact them and see if there's some sort of change that can be enacted. Our research group actually had to do just this early on in one of our study seasons. One of our urban bird survey sites is Maxwell Park, which is located in Northwest Normal and is bordered by I-55 here, West College Avenue in the south, and North Parkside Road here on the right. And Maxwell was a really important site for us because it had the only significant patch of quality shrubland in all of Bloomington-Normal. You can actually see this patch of shrubland here on the map as this darker green area. This shrubland was planted sometime in the 1980s, and it contains a lot of gray dogwood, which is a native shrub species that produces berries earlier in the season than most other dogwoods, so it's really popular for birds and other wildlife as a food source. The importance of this habitat was emphasized for us when we recorded 4 bird species here that we didn't see anywhere else in our urban survey. And these species included the Bell's vireo, the blue-gray gnatcatcher, the field sparrow, and the blue grosbeak. And the Bell's vireo and field sparrow are both SGCN, so they are already at a heightened level of concern for population decline and habitat loss. When we found out at the end of summer 2019 that the Parks Department was planning on expanding the Frisbee golf course in Maxwell Park, and that it will result in the loss of most or all of this high-quality shrubland. So when we heard this, Dr. Harper, as well as other concerned residents, sent letters to the Parks Department and notified them of this issue, of our concern, and of the importance of this native habitat. And Dr. Harper actually met with the Frisbee golf course designer and told him about the species and requested that this area be protected. And thankfully, the Parks Department and the golf course designer heard our concerns, and they have redesigned the course to minimize its impact on the shrubland. These are the 4 species that we saw: the blue-gray gnatcatcher, blue grosbeak, field sparrow, and Bell's vireo. And so we're really excited to know that this area will be protected for these species in the future. This event really goes to show that even though the threats faced by bird species are intensifying, we can make urban areas more accommodating to breeding birds, whether it's through landscaping with native trees or growing native gardens in our own backyards, volunteering to remove invasive species, or motivating our towns and cities to increase native plant use. We can help improve the future for bird populations and the habitats on which they rely. Thank you all so much for your time, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now.
Thank you, Leah. That was so interesting to hear about your research and your data. We do have a couple of questions here, and everyone feel free to add any more questions that you have in the chat. So the first one I have is from Julie, and she is asking, if I remove the non-native invasive bush honeysuckle from my woodland ravine, is that considered eliminating habitat for bird populations?
That is a really good question. Honeysuckle, like a lot of invasives, does provide some sort of ecological function. So honeysuckle, all the varieties of species, generally grows as a shrub. It can stay small, it can get pretty big, and it can provide, or it can attract some birds to the area. So if birds require some sort of understory or some sort of shrubland to be attracted to a habitat, then honeysuckle can provide that. From everything I've learned about honeysuckle specifically, it's still better to try to remove it because it becomes what we call an ecological trap, meaning that because it's this shrubby plant, because it has berries, it will attract species to it as if it's a good source of food and shelter. But because those berries are not very high in nutrients, and because it ends up damaging the rest of the habitat, it ends up harming the birds more than helping. So the birds will end up filling themselves up with something that's not great for them, while also losing out on the rest of the habitat that would actually have benefited them more. So in the short term, it might seem like fewer birds are using that area, especially if the birds have been attracted to the shrub landscape in general. but it really is best to get the invasive species out and hopefully make room for more native species to be put in its place if that habitat does still need to be restored with more shrubby habitat or greater understory density.
Okay. So Shayla is asking, how good or bad is butterfly bush for bugs? And our current Pollinator Pathways Committee chair did answer this by saying butterfly bush is not native, so it is not as valuable to support insects. And some say that it is an invasive, but Amy's experience has been that it has died off. Do you have any experience with butterfly bush, or I would like to comment on butterfly bush?
I've not had a lot of direct experience with it, but I have also heard that it's sort of subpar when it comes to supporting insects. Like I said, or similar to what I said with the honeysuckle, it can provide some support to insects, to wildlife, but including or planting native species instead of the butterfly bush is still going to be a much better option. Because I'm not as familiar with it as a plant, I can't say how well it directly compares to something like milkweed or coneflowers. But I'm sure that, or I would hope that there is one or a collection of native species out there that'd be a better replacement for the butterfly bush.
Okay. Let's see. Just a couple of comments here. Shayla also saying that they have a lot of volunteer plants like wild sunflower, which is good. Anne is saying that she tries to spread the word as much as possible that leaves and tall grasses are necessary for many critters throughout the winter and need to be left alone until after the last freeze in spring, and so that everything can hatch, and burning and throwing them away is not good. Let's see if we have any other questions here. Yes, we have another question from Anne. Do you think that the unavailability of nesting sites or limited food sources is the greater cause of declining number of birds?
I think both of those things are definitely symptoms or results of habitat loss. So when a habitat is either converted or damaged or degraded too much, what is going to be lost is the food sources and the nesting sites that those birds were looking for. So prairie specifically, when that's taken away, the birds that make their nests in the grasses or nest on the ground in the prairie are no longer going to have those sites. And so some of them will turn to those agricultural areas that have the tall crops in large expanses that can sometimes mimic tall grass prairies. But when those birds make their nests there, they're sometimes cut down or damaged as the crops are harvested. And then with those tall grass plants gone, all those insects that specific habitat supported are now also gone. So the birds that relied on the insects that were specifically found in prairies no longer have their main food source. So I would say that all of those things are sort of in the same category, that once the habitat is lost, then the main food sources and nesting sites for the birds are also gone. And so they can't feed themselves or raise their young.
Okay. So Karen is asking, how important is shelter? And she's also sharing that she has a big clump of dense bamboo, which of course is not native. That's about 15 feet tall. She does say, though, at dusk, it comes alive with roosting birds.
Yeah, so shelter is, for all living things, shelter is super important. And for birds, nesting sites and roosting sites really varies a lot by species. You're going to get some species that you'll only ever find in woodland areas because they make stick nests up in the trees, or because they're cavity nesters, and so we'll look for dead wood in which to make cavities or in which to find cavities already there. There are some species not native to Illinois that'll only nest on cliff faces. We have swallows in Illinois that'll look for places like overpasses, over creeks, and they'll build mud nests underneath the bridges. So shelter is super important. But there is no one-size-fits-all answer for birds, since all species have different needs. I do have one slide here at the end. If anyone is looking to bring some bird species into their yards or parks, there are 3 species of cavity nesters that do pretty successfully in human-made boxes, purple martins, house wrens, and eastern screech owls. If anyone is interested in those, I can give a couple more details, but yeah, shelter is huge. But when it comes to bringing nesting sites into yards, it really just varies by the bird species you'd be hoping to attract.
Okay. And Sarah has a question about what's the difference between butterfly bush and butterfly weed, which you may not necessarily know, Leah, but a few of our other members have pitched in just to clarify that butterfly weed is a milkweed. It's very different than butterfly bush. So, but I think that's a common error that people make. They think butterfly bush is the same as butterfly milkweed. And of course, milkweed, as Leah had said earlier, it can support monarch butterflies as well as other butterfly species as well. Okay, so Pat is asking, do you recommend a plant for the shade that will leave some structure? So if I'm not too sure if you're familiar enough with the whole host of native plants to answer that, but if you do have any recommendations, feel free to share.
So it asks for a plant that creates shade and brings some structure.
Yeah, or can grow in shade, I believe, or can create shade.
Right. So the first thing that comes to mind when I hear that description is trees, of course, but planting those can take more money and time than I think a lot of us have at the moment. There are some shrub species or smaller tree species that I know are fairly lucrative when it comes to birds. Serviceberry trees are popular. I've heard some good things about redbud trees, and dogwoods are a shrub that I'm not sure how well they do in backyards, but they're definitely really important as food sources and some nesting sources for shrubland birds. For smaller plants, I'm not sure any of them would produce the shade you're looking for, the structure. So I would definitely lean towards native shrubs. And then if you are able to include trees in your backyard, the oak trees and the cherry trees, white oak and chokecherry in particular, can support a lot of insect species and thus support and attract a lot of birds as well.
Okay, so Nancy is wondering if you have studied urban backyards and have you studied urban backyards where there are native plants and multiple bird feeders? So the impact of having both natural habitat as well as seed for birds to feed on.
Right. So we have not been able to study backyards directly. We've had to stay on public lands. So there's definitely an important part of urban habitat that we've not gotten to observe directly. From some literature, some scientific literature that we've read, and from some personal experiences, I can sort of answer some adjacent questions that I hope will together answer that main question. So native plants in general will always attract more native wildlife species. So insects, rodents, birds will always prefer the native species because that's what they've evolved with. That's what generally benefits them the most. In combination with bird feeders, we have a lot of bird feeders here in my yard. Dr. Harper has native plants and bird feeders in his yard. And what's important to know about bird feeders is that they will bring in a lot of birds. Everything from red-winged blackbirds to sparrows to finches, some woodpeckers. They'll love bird feeders. But the seed that usually comes in bird feeders, the seed, sometimes fruits for the orioles, nectar for the hummingbirds, suet for the woodpeckers. It'll feed them during their migratory seasons and outside of the breeding season. But seeds and nectar and suet aren't what feed the nestlings as they grow. So including bird feeders with seed or suet or nectar in our yards is still beneficial to the birds, really beneficial for suburban spaces, residences that might not have as many plants that are producing those seeds naturally. So there's definitely still a benefit to the birds, but they still need the insects the most during the breeding season, because that's where the nestlings, those so ugly they're cute baby birds, are going to get the protein and the nutrients they need to grow up into the big birds that'll then be able to eat the seeds from the bird feeders. So a mix of native plants that support insects for breeding birds and bird feeders that support adult birds in other ways definitely work together to help support bird populations. But having the insects in the yard, having the native plants in the yard, definitely I think is something that needs more attention and promotion, since it's less sought after, I think, than just including a simple bird feeder in the yard.
Okay. So Vicki is wondering who she could follow to stay abreast of this type of research. Is there a particular group, or do you recommend a specific agency, or perhaps a specific person at a particular university?
Yeah, so in our research, we've done interacting with the Illinois Ornithological Society and the American Ornithological Society. The Illinois one, because it's just states, a little bit smaller, it feels more local. They have everything from meetings like this to events to conferences. They sponsor scholarships and research. So I feel like they'd be a great organization to follow, especially since they are the Illinois Ornithological Society. They're going to have a similar understanding and care for Illinois native plants, just like the Wild Ones organization. Audubon Society is kind of one of the staples of birding, bird research, bird care. And then the American Ornithological Society is also a big one. They, from my understanding, are a little more scientific leaning, which if you're interested in science as it relates to birds and bird habitat, they are great. But I feel like if you're looking for something a little more community-based, the Illinois Ornithological Society, I think would be a better place to start. As for different scientists or researchers, authors of other papers, we have referenced Ward, Dr. Michael P. Ward, his paper that I think it was Birds in Chicago, so an even more larger and dense urban area than Bloomington-Normal. They looked at birds there, and it was that study that helped to spark or broaden our research focus. And we also looked at papers by, I forget his first name, but Dr. Walk. There were a few papers of his. I think he actually worked with Ward on that one paper that motivated our research, informed our research a lot. And then the name Douglas Tallamy has also been mentioned a lot tonight. His papers, articles, and books definitely have informed us a lot when it comes to native plants, and as native plants relate to birds. So those are some of the names and organizations that we focused on a lot that I know would have a lot of other great, incredible information.
That's great. So Shayla is wondering if you know of anyone who has looked at the promoting the habitat-friendly plantings in cemeteries. So looking at that area of cemeteries as a way to increase habitat for birds. Do you know of anyone that is doing research in that area, or any organizations that are looking to do that?
I am not aware of anyone looking into that at this point, but I'm very curious about that. I think that, with cemeteries oftentimes having so much area to them, but also being a space that is generally well maintained and protected in a sense, it would be a great space in which to implement more native landscaping. And what's also interesting about cemeteries is because they have this more protected sense about them, people are going to try to preserve them and keep them looking beautiful. In the cemetery that we did one of our urban surveys at, it had some of the biggest trees So the biggest, oldest oak trees and conifers and sycamores. And outside of our surveys, there's actually the largest patch of virgin prairie in McLean County is actually an old cemetery. So it's in the middle of, I think it's about a half hour, I think, outside of Bloomington-Normal. I can't remember in which direction, but it's in the middle of all these agricultural fields. And it's been able to survive because it has headstones. It is a cemetery, so people have respected that space and kept it safe. And through classes, we've taken a couple trips to this cemetery to get the chance to see and experience this untouched native prairie. And when we're standing in this space, it is nearly 2 to 3 feet above the agricultural fields because the cornfields have had a lot of erosion and have had a lot of lost nutrients, whereas the prairie has just had this great built up soil for so long. So I think the idea of bringing that program to cemeteries would be great. And hopefully I'll learn more about that in the future. That sounds like a great venture, a great initiative.
Thank you. So Michael is asking about mealworms. So this can be a common food that you can buy to add to bird feeders. What is your opinion about mealworms during breeding season and as a potential source for fledglings?
I am no insect specialist, so I'm not sure of the specifics of benefits of mealworms, especially when it comes to mixing them into bird feeders. I would think that if they are a native species of mealworm, that they could probably have some benefit. I don't know whether or not if they're sold live or dead, if that would make a difference. So that would be something I would have to look into to know a bit more about. But I think in the sense, if they're similar to caterpillars, it would definitely add more variety of nutrients to that birdseed mix. And so it could potentially benefit breeding birds more. But I would think that birds during the breeding season, they know where to look for the food they're going for. And so they might not naturally turn to bird feeders that are usually filled with seed to supply food to their young. So yeah, that's something I'm a bit uncertain about, but I'll look into that, the benefits of mealworms for birds.
And then kind of a follow-up to that, Melissa is asking if you have encountered any sources that support the idea of raising and releasing insects directly.
That's another one I haven't, I'm not coming to any specific sources for that. I think there has been a lot of conversation in general within the conservation field about the benefits and merits of raising endangered species or raising any sort of species partially in captivity and then, using those raised as captive birds or birds in breeding programs or any other species, whether it's bugs or other organisms, using those organisms from breeding programs to then jumpstart or increase wild populations. And there's some debate about it, about how well they work, how well breeding programs work, how well supplementing wild populations with captive species works. And I'm of the opinion that we still don't know. There's still a lot of data and time that needs to be put into endeavors like that. But my personal opinion is that it would be maybe even more, or likely would be more beneficial to put time and money into restoring the habitat that is already out there, restoring, increasing, improving the habitat that would support higher numbers of birds, higher numbers of insects that feed the birds. So at this point, I don't know of any disadvantages of buying insects, raising any sort of organism in a breeding program and then using it to increase or jumpstart wild populations, so long as that species obviously isn't non-native. But I think, or my hope is that more focus and attention is given to spaces that are already, in existence. Natural habitats that if we protected and restored these species, you wouldn't really have a need to add organisms from captivity back into these non-captive spaces.
Yeah, and so it's the Western Prairie Cemetery that
Right, that's the one.
that you were referring to, and Jan was nice enough to say that it's east of Chenoa on Route 24. So if anyone's interested in going there, it is a great place to see a native prairie, which is quite rare in this area. So that is the last question that we have in chat. Everyone is sending many, many thanks to you on your wonderful presentation and talking about this research that you've provided. And I also am so happy that you were able to spend the time with us this evening to let us know about the findings of your research. And we wish you really good luck in terms of your next steps as a scientist and helping preserve birds and habitat and all of that. So thank you, Leah.
Thank you all as well.
Have a good night, everyone.